Good afternoon, and welcome to the Wednesday afternoon conference call with Trusts Unlimited. This is Jim George speaking. I'm the non-attorney spokesman and facilitator for Trusts Unlimited, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to this call, particularly those of you calling in for the first time and those that will be listening to the replay over the next 24 to 48 hours. Before we begin, this is going to be a little bit different call today. So for those of you calling in for the first time, I strongly suggest after listening to this call, you go to our call of May 25th, which has a detailed explanation of the turnkey program we've put in place to assist you. I think there's a lot of information there for you. I would also suggest for those listening, if you have a pen and paper handy, it might be a good idea to jot down just a couple of things I'm going to mention near the end of the call. So let's get started and talk a little bit about the situation in Iraq. First, I want to talk about a window for the potential reinstitution of the dinar. Those of us that have been involved in this saga for a decade and even longer know that while we have made good progress from time to time, the Iraqi government seems to be its own worst enemy and always manufactures some sort of a complication to kick the can down the road. And to be completely fair and honest about it, that's entirely possible as we speak today. However, I still think that we have a shot at a reinstitution in the next 30 days, and I'm going to get into a little bit of an explanation of that. Generally, what I do for these calls is over the course of the week, I go to my various sources, get information. The day before the call, I make it some additional calls if I need to confirm some things, create a laundry list of all of the issues, and then try to distill it into, say, no more than 40 minutes, probably 20 to 30-minute discussion. I was able to get on the call last week. As a matter of fact, it kind of bumped into last week's call, and I have so much information. I'm having a hard time trying to distill it to the point where I can just briefly explain to you where we are, why I think we are where we are. My desk right now, ordinarily I'm an orderly person, and I have everything in its place, but it looks like Skylab crashed on this desk this morning because I've got stuff pinned up all over the place. So it may seem like I'm wandering a little bit today, but I'm going to try to get the information out to you. First, let's talk a little bit about the caretaker government. There's a difference of opinion in Iraq about what the caretaker government parameters are, what is and what is not constitutional, and what the caretaker government can and cannot do. That's a little different from the observation, which is the government, and I would argue, has routinely conducted extra constitutional operations. So it's kind of hard to argue that to do A or B would be unconstitutional, particularly when that argument's coming from someone that did C or D in the past, which was extra constitutional. We have a parliamentary system in Iraq. It's much more complicated than many parliamentary systems, and a parliamentary system by nature is much more complicated than our system. And as I've said in the past, if you lay on top of that all of the tribal and sectarian issues, it's just a hodgepodge, and it really it's very chaotic. So we have to try to cut through all of this and try to figure out exactly what's going on. One thing I will mention, though, for those that argue that we cannot proceed with a caretaker government in terms of the 2022 budget and change in the exchange rate, passage of the food security law kind of puts that argument to rest, because where is the line for the caretaker government. They can either do everything or they can do nothing, but you just can't arbitrarily draw a line. So what they can and can't do. So we'll see how that proceeds. So the only way I can think to proceed is we're going to just take a view of all of this from 30,000 feet and kind of review what we've been through and where we are, in hopes that we can come up with a plausible explanation for what we can expect in the next 30 days and certainly for the rest of this year. Again, where the budget's concerned, since the caretaker government's already signed off on the food security law, and while the oil and gas law was in negotiation, presumably to be signed off on as well, it's kind of hard to argue that you can't sign off on the budget. Where the change in the exchange rate is concerned, the government signing off, whether it's a caretaker government or duly elected government, is kind of a perfunctory act anyway, because the CBI has the unilateral authority to change the exchange rate. So, in my opinion, the fact that there's a caretaker government should not be an impediment to passage of the 2022 budget or a change in the exchange rate. Now, of course, the people, for their own reasons that want to stop this, are going to go running with their hair on fire to the federal Supreme Court. But I have a feeling that the court either would refuse to hear the case or would be very hesitant to nullify passage of the budget or change in the exchange rate, because that's such good progress for the country and for the people of Iraq. I don't know whether the federal government, frankly, would have the guts to nullify all of that. So it seems to me that the budget and the exchange rate could happen. However, there is one other complication that we're going to get into, and then this will bring up a constitutional issue as well. Let me point out, though, that embedded in the food and security law basically is the parameters for the oil and gas law, taxes and tariff reforms, the white paper reforms, end of corrupt practices, funds for infrastructure, transitioning to a private economy, and, of course, all of the citizen entitlement programs. So, there's a lot that's already there, which those that argue it's unconstitutional, I think, have lost the argument. In addition, we still have, as controllers of the caretaker government, in my opinion, the best people. We have Kazemi as Prime Minister, Salih as President of the Republic, and al-Habussi as Speaker of the House, and that's a good group. Now, this brings us to the situation with the recent resignation of the Sadrists. Now, the Sadrists, of course, are followers of Sadr and the Sadrist movement, which basically was the catalyst for the white papers, and for the citizen entitlement and all of that. And the Sadrists were temporarily outflanked by the Framework Coalition, which was a loose confederation of the pro-Iranian Shia, ranging from moderate Shia, the individuals that are willing to compromise on issues, to the more radical 12th Imamers that are really hardcore pro-Iranian. So what the Sadrists decided to do was they decided to take a 40-day hiatus and give the coalition framework an opportunity to form a government. Well, that effort crashed and burned. In the meantime, the Sadrists put together the tripartite coalition, which basically was a loose coalition of all the Sadrists and the Kurds. And that group was stronger than the coalition framework. But, of course, rather than concede and accept the fact that the framework had their opportunity and they failed, now they're trying to scuttle the tripartite. So now it looks as like the resignation of the Sadrists could result in the parliament being dissolved. If the parliament is resolved, what does that leave in place? It leaves in place the caretaker government of Kazemi, Salih, and al-Habussi. Then the issue becomes, if the parliament's dissolved, can the caretaker government proceed with the other issues that need to be dealt with, i.e., implementation of the food security law, passage of the 2022 budget, presiding over the CBI's change in the exchange rate. I would argue that they could. And the reason I would argue that is there's no one else in place to go to the federal Supreme Court to challenge it. The other issue about dissolving the parliament, which is why it might not take place, is if the parliament's dissolved, that means that the corrupt pro-Iranian officials in the parliament will have lost their immunity, and they certainly don't want that. So we'll see how all of that plays out. But I just have a feeling, of course I could be wrong, but my gut tells me that this actually might be the opportunity to push all of this stuff through. Now, I've done this in the past, but I want to talk about why, in my opinion, the reinstitution and revaluation of the dinar is not a scam, and it's only a matter of when and not if this occurs. The first thing I want to loosely mention is the Basel Accords, going all the way back to 71, and I'm going to have to give you a little history here. I know it seems a little long-winded, but in terms of the United States, let's start with the United States. We have to go all the way back to the meeting at Jekyll Island in 1910. It's a group of businessmen, influential politicians, billionaires, and what they wanted to do was to construct legislation for the formation of a Federal Reserve Bank, which was accomplished in 1913, and the federal income tax. Now, why did we need the Federal Reserve Bank and along with the federal income tax? If you look at a dollar bill prior to 1913, it says United States dollar. If you look at a dollar bill now, it says Federal Reserve note. The Federal Reserve is not federal, and it's not a reserve. It's a private entity. It has no reserves. It literally prints helicopter money, lends it to the federal government at interest. The federal government had to establish a federal income tax in order to pay interest on the Federal Reserve note. And we operated with that for about 30-some years. Then, near the end of World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Conference, which was held in Brentwood, New Hampshire, 1944, basically created the IMF system, and the U.S. dollar was the number one reserve world currency. One of the first things they did was create the funds to rebuild Europe. So the United States dollar was literally, globally, the coin of the realm. And we operated that way for nearly another 30 years. But remember, and if anyone as old as I am can remember, you could take that dollar to the bank and get a silver dollar for it because it was backed currency. When we were kids, we used to go collect these used soda bottles from the parks, take the soda bottles back in, get 2 cents for every bottle, get ourselves a couple of bucks, and we go to the bank, get some silver dollars, and that's the way we collect the silver dollars. Well, in 1971, the United States went off the gold standard. There was no more silver certificates, and we transitioned to the petrodollar. And I don't want to go into a lot about the petrodollar, but from our point of view, what this means is the United States dollar went full fiat, meaning it wasn't backed by any commodity. It was backed by the quote-unquote full faith and credit of the United States. Now, by going full fiat, that means that the government printing of money would not be limited to the amount of commodities they had to back it, but limited only on the amount that the government decided that they needed to borrow from the Federal Reserve. What happened? Well, we know what happened. They printed tons of money. We're now in $30 trillion of debt, and we're on the border of hyperinflation. Inflation is not the increased value of goods and services. Inflation is reduced purchasing power of the U.S. dollar. Now, when the Federal Reserve was established back in 1913, they had two main objectives. One, keep inflation within 2%, and two, keep us at full employment, meaning under 5% unemployment. The Federal Reserve Bank has completely, totally, and utterly failed at this objective. It should be audited. People should go to jail. These people have stolen trillions of dollars from working Americans. We will see if there's a change in the House and the Senate if we finally get a vote on the floor for an audit of the Federal Reserve. But again, fiat money inherently loses its purchasing power. We're witnessing how that works today. Now, why am I bringing all of this up? The reason I'm bringing it up is because there's one more shoe that needs to drop. Because now in Europe and now in the United States as well, they're pushing, and I'm talking about the international agencies, the IMF, all of the central banks, Bank of International Settlement, all of them, and the U.S. Treasury, all of a sudden under Yellen, which is no surprise, is pushing for a digital currency. What's a digital currency mean? It means you are not the owner and possessor of your wealth. It means the amount of your wealth that you possess in currencies is not under your control. With a digital currency, you can't put that money in your pocket. You can't just give someone some money out of your pocket. You can't put it under your mattress if you want. You can't hoard it if you want. You can only do two things with a digital currency. You can either leave it in the bank, which is now run centrally by the Treasury Department, or you can exchange it digitally for some good or service, but you have no possession of it. And because the government has possession of it, that means they can change the rules. They can tell you, for example, what you can and can't buy with that digital currency. They can use something called a social credit score to determine how much of your money must remain within the bank. There's any number of things these people can do. Now, why am I bringing all of this up? The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because the trust package that we've marketed for over a decade to dinarians, and which is very critical entity to create prior to revaluation, has much more application in general for individuals, whether they have currencies or not, whether they have other assets that they think are going to appreciate or not. This trust is just about the only way you can mitigate what the federal government, what the central banks are attempting to do. The family unit is under assault. Western culture is under assault. But these trusts can protect you from what they're attempting to do. And by the way, these trusts are settled law and part of Western culture going back for thousands of years. These are the same trusts that the emperors of Rome used in order to protect their wealth from the Senate. These are the same trusts that the royalty in Europe used to protect their wealth from the monarchs. These are the same trusts that were utilized in the United States prior to the creation of the United States when we were a colony, when individuals wanted to protect the land grants that they had been given from the monarchs of Europe. And these are the same trusts, whether you have currencies or not, that are going to protect you in a number of ways. First, this asset protection family trust will protect your privacy. No one will know your net worth or your actual holdings unless they go to a court and show cause, show evidence that you can perform some kind of a fraud against them, which would allow the courts to peer into your trust. These trusts provide asset protection as well. Individuals thinking they have a legitimate claim against you, once again, are going to have to go to a court. prove their case, and these trusts are structured in such a way as to make it extremely expensive and extremely time-consuming to pursue civil litigation. These trusts can help to lower your taxes, lowering gift taxes, lowering income taxes, eliminating the federal estate tax. These trusts can also provide flight from these digital currencies and other financial assets, because this is the best way through a package of trusts to own financial assets like homes, cars, boats, cryptocurrencies, precious and industrial metals, REITs, which are real estate investment trusts, and even direct ownership of real estate. This is the only way that you can protect your privacy and your wealth from the intrusion of government, frivolous lawsuits, civil confiscations, and this onerous, and I believe it's onerous, digital currency. A digital currency is absolute control of your life. So you need to transition out of digital currencies to tangible assets, and bar none, the best way to own tangible assets is through a package of irrevocable trusts. Now, I mentioned earlier that I wanted you to have a pen and paper handy because I was going to give you a little information. There's a couple of things I think you ought to look into to help explain what's going on in this country. The first is something called Cloward and Piven, Cloward and Piven, Piven. This was the original theory to open up our southern border and to eliminate all borders in order to create chaos and financial calamity, in order to allow the government to create a martial law scenario and nullify literally the Bill of Rights. Then there is something called Agenda 21. This has to do with population control, financial control. Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2050. Now, all of these things are hyper-political issues. It's very depressing to read this stuff. The only credit I'll give these people, at least they're telling us all of the bad things that they're planning to do to us. But once again, this trust package is your way to protect yourself and make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for these people to intrude into your personal lives, into your families, into your accumulation of wealth, and protection of that wealth from their confiscation. Now, I want to give you our contact information. Again, those of you calling in for the first time, I strongly suggest you listen to our call of May 25th because it has a complete, detailed explanation of our turnkey program to assist those of you with currencies. But whether you have currencies or not, given what's going on in this country right now, the irrevocable family trust package is the best thing a family can do to protect themselves from this intrusive government. You can go to our website, which is trusts with an S, unlimitedllc.com. You can go to our email, which is trusts with an S, unlimitedllc@gmail.com. And you can go to our phone service, which is 307-274-4122. Now, one thing I did not get into was with Basel III compliance. I mentioned it earlier, but I want to touch on it one more time. Basel compliance began in the 1970s after we went to a fiat currency and what the central banks went fiat. This was a way to try to keep the banks in line by having a certain amount of the money in their banks protected with a certain amount of capital. And unfortunately, in my opinion, it was not really very much. There were 5 phases, Basel 1 through 5. We're looking right now at implementation of Basel III. Now, the general transition from fiat-based to commodity-backed currencies is very important, because fiat currencies will always implode, and they'll always create hyperinflation. That's what's happening right now. And had the federal government passed Build Back Better at an estimated cost of $6 trillion versus the $1.9 trillion that they did pass, we'd easily be looking at double-digit inflation. We actually, if you look at the actual numbers, the way inflation was calculated for decades, we're somewhere between 15 and 17% inflation. But because they jerry-rigged the numbers, they've got it at 8.6. It's probably twice that. But the one thing that I did not mention about Iraq is that Iraq is arguably the richest country in the world per square mile. Iraq sits in the Tigris-Euphrates River Delta, which means silt from the Caucasus mountain range has been flowing down into that river delta for eons. That means that soil, that area is got very rich soil, which is very good for agriculture. It means it's very rich in necessary rare earth minerals. It's got precious metals. It's got industrial metals. And it's all very easily mined because it's that soft, again, river delta. Iraq also has the second largest known oil reserves in the Middle East, but it has the sweetest crude. What does that mean? It means that their crude is lowest in sulfur content. Why is that important? It's important because it means that Iraqi sweet crude oil can be refined much more cheaply and much more quickly. Why is that important? Because only about 60% of refined petroleum is used in the combustion engine. 40% of it's used in the production of glass, plastics, textiles, pharmaceuticals, electronics, and nanotechnologies. Your smartphone, your computer, just about everything you utilize on a regular basis can only be created through fossil fuels. There's not enough wind and solar in the entire universe, let alone planet Earth, to create one smartphone. So when you hear about green energy, you need to understand this. There's another thing people need to understand. About 150 years ago, John D. Rockefeller Sr. paid scientists to tell consumers that petroleum was in fact fossil fuels. It was the finite remnant of the dinosaurs. Now, why would he perpetuate that lie? Because by declaring petroleum as a finite substance, he could charge more for it. It's no more complicated than that. But that's in fact not true. Petroleum is the original renewable substance. Petroleum is created through the interaction of bacteria with plants and with algae. And there is nothing more prevalent on planet Earth than bacteria. We have an unlimited supply of oil which renews itself all of the time. This is why the green new energy thing is not going to work. This is why the truth regarding petroleum is becoming more and more understood by the average consumer. And because Iraq has the largest or second largest known oil reserves and it's a sweet crude, they're going to be Basel III, Basel IV, and Basel V compliant. Their dinar is one of the strongest, even though it's in a program rate right now, based on their underlying natural resources and their ability now to bring those resources to market. They're going to be a strong currency. This currency is going to revalue. It's only a matter of when and not if. And I'm still leaning toward it happening sooner rather than later. So that's basically the essence of what I wanted to talk about today. Those of us that have currencies Be of good cheer because, as I said, this is a when, not an if issue. But if you're an American citizen possessing any amount of wealth at all, or anticipate either through the possession of these currencies or your own hard work and efforts accumulating for your family, if you want the government to stay out of your private affairs, if you want your wealth to be an issue for only you to be involved in, if you want to reduce your taxes, eliminate the possibility of civil litigation, civil confiscation, and all of that, I strongly suggest you contact us, get our initial package, establish your family asset protection trust, and tell the federal government where they can go. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week. Certainly if something of dramatic nature were to happen between now and then, we'll try to get out an emergency email and schedule an emergency conference call. But failing that, we'll be back next week, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Thanks for listening, everyone, and have a great week. Bye-bye.